It's 1898, 13 years after the death of General Charles Gordon and the fall of Khartoum.
Britain is going back to the Sudan,
not just to avenge the general,
but to secure an empire.
Up the Nile comes an army,
Railways, gunboats, and modern firepower.
and once again,
An adventurous Winston Churchill is determined to be there.
this is Young Man in a Hurry, Episode 4, A War of Empires.
On Churchill, the finest half hour.
Welcome to Churchill, the finest half hour. I'm Professor Richard Toy. With me is Dr. Warren Doctor, and we are continuing our adventure into new territory.
That's right. We'll be looking at Winston Churchill on one of his greatest adventures and also creating one of his greatest histories today. And I think it's really important that the River War, as he called it, or the Anglo-Dervish War, there are lots of names for this particular war, is a really fascinating moment in colonial British history and the British Empire, I think. And so it bears doing a deep dive to understand how we get to the point, because, Richard, you'll know this, the title to Churchill's book, The River War, is actually The River War, a reconquest of Sudan.
Yeah, this is actually a very good point that you make, because the book which Churchill eventually wrote wasn't just a straightforward adventure. It was a deep dive into everything which had led up to this reconquest of the Sudan.
Like you say, it's an enormous, significant history of the conflict and why they're there. And I think, honestly, in my opinion, it's still one of the best books about this particular conflict.
Absolutely. I guess two things to note is that obviously at the point where he actually arrived in Sudan, took part in the fighting, he didn't know everything, which he subsequently learned in the process of writing and researching this enormous book. However, of course, there was some things which he did know of Sudan and its significance in British imperial culture, which would have been common knowledge to maybe not everybody in Victorian Britain, but certainly this was in some ways a pretty hot button issue in the politics of the 1880s and the 1890s.
That's right. And this is for our listeners at home, particularly in America. You may ask yourself, what has Great Britain got to do in Egypt? Well, it's the real secret message here is the canal, right? The Suez Canal. Basically, Britain had, by the 1880s, enormous interests in Egypt. And the Egyptians took some umbrage to this, and there was a very popular uprising in 1882, led by a man named Urabi Pasha. This created a crisis in the British Empire about how fully they wanted to be involved in controlling Egypt and controlling the country.
Right. And I mean, let's make clear sort of the link to Sudan here as well. What was the connection between the two countries?
Right, of course. And that is to do with the fact that at one time, Egypt and Sudan were together under British rule, under the control of the Egyptian army.
Yes, but remember, of course, that the British didn't formally occupy Egypt until 1882. So this condominium, I think, as it was eventually called.
That's it. That's correct. It's a condominium.
Essentially, what had happened was that the Egyptians had been in charge of Sudan. The British had been semi-controlling or heavily influencing the Egyptians, but they hadn't had full control. I would say it wasn't only the Suez Canal. There was the question of debts which were owed by the Egyptians, often to British bondholders. And some people said, well, Gladstone, actually the Liberal Prime Minister, you might have expected it was a Conservative Prime Minister who was going to invade, but actually it was Gladstone. The fact that he personally was a bondholder and was sort of stood to profit from it makes people think that maybe this wasn't a totally disinterested, benign conquest.
No, that's completely right. And calling it a conquest is an interesting thing. So what happened was there was this uprising. Urabi Pasha assumed control of Alexandria, and then almost immediately Britain sent in by gunboat diplomacy its ships to control the city from the coast, which it did effectively. There were some bombing raids where they fired on the city, and effectively Urabi Pasha left the position and turned control of Egypt and the whole condominium, as it was called, to Great Britain. And then Britain set up a military occupation there, and so it became a real interesting thing. But in order to secure Egypt, So the theory went, you would also have to control Sudan. And the issue with controlling Sudan, there was a group of people who lived there called the Dervish. And the dervishes were a particular, this is very important, a particular sect of Islam that is actually more aligned with Shia than with Sunni. I don't want to say it's a very specific type of Islam where they believe more fatalistically about things, and I won't get into all the ins and outs of it, but they had a leader who had declared himself the Mahdi, which is
Yeah.
effectively synonymous with like a
Yeah,
prophetic type Christ
the
figure.
guided one, I think, is
That's right.
one possible translation. And his name was Mohammed Ahmad bin Abdullah, but he's always referred to as the Mahdi. So yeah, and I mean, I guess you sort of it may be really worth emphasizing the complexity of these relationships because it was the sort of the Egyptians who were controlling Sudan. It was them who were then battled by the Mahdi, and the British start to get sucked in basically in the 1880s. And so we've already mentioned at the head of the episode General Gordon. And he is somebody who is absolutely fundamental to the mythology of this particular war and the perception that he was abandoned by the British was crucial.
And this is something that Randolph Churchill would later play up on. But what effectively happened was because they got sucked into the Sudanese adventure, the British Parliament were like, well, we need to settle this once and for all. Who's the man that can do this? And comes along General Charles Gordon, who is, and I think this is important, quintessential imperial colonial hero, man of action,
Yeah.
a man who served in Asia and elsewhere, who really, was a national hero. And he stepped into the breach and said, I'll lead an expedition. And he did. He led an expedition to Khartoum, furthest outpost of, I'm going to say, the Egyptian military, the British Empire, whatever you want to frame that. And he asked for reinforcements. There was a standoff between him and the Mahdi. The Mahdi had sieged Khartoum, and he had asked for reinforcements. It was a huge political issue. And then no reinforcements came, and ultimately the Mahdi sacked Khartoum in 1885, completely destroying all the British forces, including.
And I mean, I think it's worth saying, of course, that the British knew that Gordon was in trouble, and they did send an expedition to try and rescue him, which arrived 2 days too late. I'm going to quote from Churchill actually writing in 1932 here, when he writes a new preface to The River, and he talks about the massacre of Gordon and the evacuation of Sudan. And then he says, however, the story had sunk deeply into British hearts. Very slowly, patiently, cautiously, and frugally, the British government set about the recovery of the ruined territories. And so later on in the passage, he says, more than 10 years after the sack of Khartoum, the first advance into the Dongola province began. I think it's worth saying that we have this image of the late Victorian Empire as being sort of very expansive and growing all over the place. But it is worth remembering that it did experience setbacks and reverses, and that, as in this case, didn't permanently accept defeat, but certainly accept a tactical withdrawal. And the response to that is, well, this requires a lot of preparation and a lot of money. If we rush in again, we're going to get burned again.
That's right, Richard. And so basically, it was a slow, methodical way to wage war because they didn't want a repeat of what had happened with Charles Gordon and with the Expeditionary Force after the fact. So the man for the job, who was basically tasked with dealing with this, was Horatio Kitchener, who became Sardar of the Egyptian army, he was obviously British and with the British military, but the rank of Sardar was given to him of the Egyptian military. So he had Anglo-Egyptian forces. I think this is important to remember. But he is tasked with the idea of going back to Khartoum and reclaiming this territory for Egypt. And Kitchener is real interesting as a general for lots of different reasons. But a lot of people know Kitchener, of course, from the First World War and the poster with the mustache. That's what he's famous for. But before the First World War, he was famous for this particular strategy. And what he did was very slowly, methodically go along and develop logistics all his way down the river. The river changed constantly, but he reinforced every position, which took a long time with railroad, and that way you won't ever overextend because you're bringing your supplies with you effectively. And this environment that Churchill recognizes that there's a showdown coming and decides that he wants to be a part of it.
Absolutely. And Churchill, of course, writing after the war, devotes actually an entire chapter 9 of volume 1 of the River War, which he calls the Desert Railway. And he makes the point, and most people, when they start thinking about war, they start thinking about the fighting. And he says, I quote, "The long trailing line of communications is unnoticed." And he says that the glorious uncertainties of the field can yet reverse everything, but such considerations apply with greater force to wars where both sides are equal in equipment and discipline. In savage warfare in a flat country, the power of modern machinery is such that flesh and blood can scarcely prevail, and the chances of battle are reduced to a minimum. Fighting is primarily a matter of transport. The Caliph was conquered on the railway.
That's a fantastic quote, Richard. And one of my favorite points that he says is, it carried the army, talking about the Desert Railway, it carried the army across the deserts where no army had ever marched, and it enabled it to move with a rapidity which astonished even its enemies.
So that's a perfect place to take a break. We'll come back and we'll talk about Churchill's personal journey.
How he got there. Welcome back to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Dr. Warren Doctor, and with me, the Maxim gun to my spear, Professor Richard Toy.
So, well, actually, if I got the Maxim gun, maybe I stand a better chance. I don't know. But let's see. We've talked about the sort of background to the campaign. We should have mentioned, of course, that the Mahdi had died by this point that we've got to in 1898, and sort of the key figure who was commanding the Dervish army was known as the Khalifa. And Churchill, of course, has just published his book, The Story of the Malacan Field Force. It's been pretty well received, typos aside, but he's hungry for more.
That's right. And he sees, obviously, an opportunity here to be a part of what Kitchener's trying to do. But there's one small problem. I alluded to this in one of our last episodes. Kitchener doesn't particularly care for Churchill or for any subaltern who's trying to critique strategic maneuvers. And he saw a lot of the things in Churchill's book about the Malacan Field Force as overstepping his position.
Right. And in a way, that kind of shows that in some ways, Churchill had achieved, well, one of the things what he wanted was that the commander of the Egyptian army knew who he was. But on the other hand, that was not in a good way. So it was a double-edged sword.
And so he has to find his way into Kitchener's good graces so that he can actually join the campaign in the first place.
Right. And so Kitchener repeatedly blocking his applications to join his staff. And so again, Churchill has to pull strings and turns to his mother, Lady Randolph, to sort of lobby her network in London.
And he even had this. I love this. He even had to rely on Lord Salisbury, right, who's the leader of the Conservatives in Parliament, to intervene on his behalf.
Yes, and Prime Minister again by this stage. So he's sort of.
Oh yes, that's right. Yeah.
And certainly Salisbury had been impressed by the Churchill's book, The Story of the Malacan Field Force, in a fairly transparent effort to suck up to the Prime Minister. He had dedicated it to Salisbury, which Salisbury had accepted. He actually asked his permission, may I do this? And so he was, he in spite of Kitchener's refusal, obstinacy, you might call it, Churchill ends up getting a sort of last-minute vacancy in the 21st Lancers. And that was a regiment which was under the direct control of the War Office in London, and so thereby bypassing Kitchener's control over the Egyptian army.
That's right, because Churchill's mother had a relationship with Sir Evelyn Wood, who was in charge of the appointments at the War Office. But Churchill was still able to use this contact to land him right where he wanted to go.
Yeah, he was a pretty privileged guy, really. There were people who were falling over themselves really to help out. And nobody says, well, it's totally outrageous that you're using your personal connections to try and control army appointments.
No, and if anything, I think it was rather expected. So he relies on these relationships his mother's forged. He successfully gets, and because he's in the Lancers, which is of course a cavalry unit, so he go out on reconnaissance missions and that stuff. And later in his book, which again we'll talk about more fully later on, he writes a great deal about the use of espionage and intelligence and going undercover. But I do want to reveal, and this is for all you nerds out there. You know, Richard and I have talked about there's a difference between the first edition of this book, which is in 2 massive volumes, and the second edition, which is a much slimmer 1-volume set. And in the full first edition, Churchill recounts an episode where he's out on a reconnaissance mission, a dervish, and he immediately takes him hostage. And the dervish protesting against it, he doesn't really understand it, he's protesting. And Churchill ties him up and is able to bring him back to the camp, only to discover that he had gotten one of his own men who had gone undercover. And he himself had become caught in this, and he reports this back to the newspaper and even records this in the book, but then becomes enormously embarrassed that he had been fooled by this guy and then removes it from the second edition of the book.
And I mean, of course, you mentioned the newspapers. So again, just as in on the Northwest frontier, Churchill is eager to find renown by communicating with the newspaper and also to make money. And he gets a contract with the Morning Post. He later recalls the terms as £250 a month, all expenses paid, entire discretion as to movements and opinions. So I guess he was definitely seen as an asset. Remember that the newspapers had columns to fill. This was the age of the expanding popular press, and there was a lot of competition. And so if you could get some picturesque color from what was expected to be a really major and important military campaign, this was something which was mutually beneficial to the paper and to him.
And just going back to you mentioning that there's lots of space to fill, there's an interesting moment when one of the Times of London has 2 correspondents there, one of whom was killed. And Churchill was recruited by the Times to fill this spot and wrote a report. And Kitchener vetoed him being published in the Times and basically told the Times they couldn't have Churchill stuff, which also raises a question to me, which is, he's like, well, Churchill can write that old trashy Morning Post or whatever, but I'll not have him in the Times. That's where gentlemen are published. The animosity between Kitchener and Churchill has fascinated. That's a kind of recurring theme in the River War, is them butting heads.
Yes, and of course, we were anticipating that they would end up as cabinet colleagues in the first months, the First World War. So another point to make, of course, is again going back to the journalism. Churchill was almost maniacally inventive and wanting to do things differently, and has this idea. If we remember that the previous time he'd been upset that his letters had been published under the name of just a young not showing who he was, and he was upset about that. Now this time he had the idea that they would be published anonymously, and then there would be a big reveal at the end going, hey, it's me, Winston Churchill. Now the people in the Morning Post fairly sensibly, I think, kind of go, no, we're not going to do that.
Absolutely not.
But they're not so bothered by literary elegance. They just want basic facts, really. And Churchill is complaining to his mother that they've turned what I've written into mere banal penny a line journalism, which is a little bit unfair because he has got all these vivid descriptions of the desert landscape and the slender poles and white insulators of the telegraph wire, which he, again, I think we should emphasize that he's not just interested in this technology because it's interesting, but because he sees it as part of the civilization, the British civilization that he wants to extend.
It's about the advance of civilization, what liberal empire can do for the world to bring order to this chaos. And I think you see that in his writing. And, again, as we said in India, his writing's actually pretty good. The visual imagery he writes about the desert and the steamers and life on the Nile and those kinds of things. I think are really remarkable. But also, important to draw a distinction for the way he was writing or coming at the what he was doing in the Malacan Field Force, because that feels different. It feels like spiraling out of control, right? Because it's a part of the great game, and he has to leave, and things are, it looks like things are increasing in complexity. Whereas this has a final point. There's a real serious reason they're going there. We have ends to accomplish. We have stated goals. And so again, I think he presents it as march of civilization, and he uses those sort of Western civilization type language to indicate that they were going into an area that was perhaps uncivilized and civilizing it using this technology of rail and telegrams and telegraphs and so forth.
Completely. And I mean, his idea of what civilization is very much wrapped up with creature comforts, right? I mean, we know that Churchill really liked to take a bath. I mean, particularly in later life.
Yes.
We've actually talked about that in previous episodes during World War II. He liked to get in and have a good soak and maybe dictate a few letters and so on. And so when eventually Khartoum falls after the Battle of Omdurman and the Khalifa has fled, Churchill goes and looks around the Khalifa's apartment, and guy goes, pretty much literally says in his book, well, this guy had a really nice bathroom. He can't have been all bad.
Yeah, no, he did. And he was surprised at how technologically advanced the Mahdi's bathroom was, because, of course, the Khalifa had moved in. But to your point, one of my favorite stories, there's a story about him in Plugstrada in the First World War, during trench warfare, where he insisted on taking a bath in the trenches underground. I mean, he loves a bath, this guy. That's what I'm saying.
Absolutely. Loving a bath is kind of quite normal, but there's also some more wacky stuff mixed into this story. Some nice little detail. Before Churchill sets off from London, he talks to the president of the Society for Psychical Research, who basically says, if you die, can you try to communicate with me through the ether? And he kind of goes, all right, I guess I can. And so then his mother waves him off as he catches the train from Marseille. And 6 days later, he's in Cairo, and he finds that 2 squadrons of the 21st Lancers had already started up the Nile, and the next were to leave the next morning.
So one of the things he records as well, once he gets to Africa and he discovers the 21st Lancers, a couple of them have already left, he immediately goes as well. And he talks about how wonderful the journey was from that point forward. Everyone had things done at their comfort and convenience. All the company was cheery and novel, and the scenery just streamed past. So, I mean, he's basically going down on the Nile, riding the Nile down into the war zone, I suppose you'd say. And it's always struck me how interesting his picturesque language is about the fact that he's about to go get into a war.
Yeah, and like what he's actually worrying about is that he might not get into the war because he's set off with the approval of the War Office, but he thinks that Kitchener may be trying to override that. And he's sort of imagining him sending lots of telegrams of protest, which might prevent Churchill from actually fighting. And so every time that the train comes up to a station, he worries that some staff officer may be coming to give him a message that he's not wanted. He says, I suppose a criminal flying from justice goes through the same emotions at every stopping point. But he says he's moved towards a position of hope that grows in his heart. And he starts thinking that surely on the eve of this critical battle, with all these things to worry about, then Kitchener isn't going to have enough time to think about this subaltern officer. He might just forget, or he might not have been told. And so actually he's right that Kitchener, when he was told about the appointment by the War Office, had just shrugged his shoulders and passed on, as Churchill put it later, to what after all, matters of greater concern.
And I think that that's so remarkable that he's effectively in his own mind, like undercover, trying to get into his own army. And then to find out later, because we see that in my early life, when he said he found out that when Kitchener found out, he was just like, well, whatever, fine. So Churchill had created all this worry for himself for no reason.
Absolutely. Winston Churchill has made it to the war.
And now he has to prove himself in it.
Next time,
Omdurman.
One of the most one-sided battles in imperial history.
And one of the most revealing. here on Churchill, the finest half hour.
And in the meantime, KBO.